So, Valentina, maybe we could start just by asking, like, what's your professional developer background? Like, where did you get the skills that allowed you to write a book like this?
Right. Well, first of all, right now I am employed by ThoughtWorks as a lead software developer. I'm working for an Italian client. But basically, you can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. Throughout my career, I've been basically always a consultant, which means I have a lot of technical breadth, but not a lot of depth in any specific topic. But I was very lucky to work with about, I think, a dozen different clients.
Well,
I think
okay.
I counted 13 last time.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of different clients and different ways of working, and people who are doing maybe barely continuous integration, maybe continuous delivery, and fortunately, because I got to write a book about it, a lot that were doing continuous deployment as well. So
yeah.
I've taken that experience from the ones who were doing continuous deployment, either they started after I joined or they were already doing it, and I tried to condense it in a book like this because essentially I didn't find enough resources online, and I found myself repeating the same concepts over and over, maybe to some new colleagues, and I decided, you know what, it would be just easier if there was a book. Yeah.
And that wasn't true though, was it? It wasn't easier to write a book.
No, it wasn't easier in the end. It's easier now that the book is written.
Yeah. Cool. So one thing I'd like to draw just from when you talk about those clients is that like these include, serious companies where serious money is at stake if the site is not available, right? So this is not, Valentina's not going to talk about techniques that you can kind of try for stuff that doesn't matter, or if it's down, then you'll fix it, it's fine. This is like, things that if they're down during, Black Friday, we'd measure millions per hour, might be a unit that would come up, right?
Yeah. No POCs, everything in production, very much in front of a lot of people, and especially there were some retail clients where this meant if part of the website was down, it was going to cost some serious money.
So we're talking about some grown-up stuff, not play stuff. Before we get into that though, I wanted to ask kind of a get-to-know-you question. So the one that I chose was what's your favorite nerdy book? I mean, there's a lot of nerds here, so probably they will know similar ones to you.
So I'm gonna pick a very famous one that I assume a lot of people have read. It's Clean Code by Uncle Bob. I really like it because it kind of brings me back to the basics. So I think in ThoughtWorks and in this type of conferences, often we think about all of these really fancy practices. Let's do FinOps, DevOps, microservices, event-driven stuff. But ultimately, even with continuous delivery, deployment, it all boils down to how good your code is if you can do these practices. Even though we don't talk about this kind of stuff very much still, because it's been 20 years that it has come out, this book, it's still relevant. So, and it's the first book I read when I started, and I think it really gave me that mindset of, okay, technical quality is the baseline for any business practice you want to do.
There's not much point in doing everything else if your code is shit.
Yeah, exactly.
I find that an interesting answer because when I read Clean Code, it was kind of transformative for me, but also there's something kind of has an attitude of if your code is bad, it's because you are bad or you've been unprofessional. And to be clear, this is very much not the attitude we get from your book, which is, kind of bringing people up. But did you get that sense from the book when you first read it? Or?
Maybe there was a little bit of judgment, but also, it's something that I needed to hear as a very junior person. I think software is an industry where people kind of come here from all walks of life, and when I was very junior, sometimes I would be like, okay, if it works, it's good enough, right? Nobody's gonna know how bad the code is behind it. They just see the pretty interface. So I just needed to, that kind of tone maybe from this book where it would say, look, you have to be professional about the code you write and think you're not a lone contributor. You're in a company where, maintainability matters. Making things understandable by your colleagues matters. It's a matter of professionalism, not a matter of does it just work.
Right. I think that's a good message. So maybe now we're moving to your book. Do you want to tell us a bit about what's in it?
Right. So as you can see it's here.
Okay. So it's about this deep for people who can't see in the back, and about this tall. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this book. It's about continuous deployment. Should I just talk about the practice?
Sure, yeah.
All right, so basically, continuous deployment, I decided to write about it because it's a practice that a lot of companies are doing as kind of a natural step forward to continuous delivery, but maybe they're not really acknowledging it, and it does have some differences. It's basically where you do continuous delivery in a way that you put your newly committed code on your remote, so a main or a master, and this code will make it all the way through production uninterrupted and unchecked by basically any manual action. This means that your automation, your pipeline, and your tests, they need to be excellent in order to allow for no manual oversight in this path to production. And so I find that most companies still do continuous delivery with some manual steps, especially, they have the classic staging environment where all code basically goes to rot for maybe days, weeks, or hopefully not months, but sometimes months. And then they have, these sign-off meetings, these demos where they check everything they've built in the last few weeks, all at once, basically, a whole bunch of code, and then they do a deployment to production manually later. So continuous deployment gets rid of that. So there's no manual intervention by anyone in the path to production. There is only when writing code and tests, and then after the deployment has happened. So it can seem quite a bit of a radical practice, but it can be done, and that's why I put case studies, because sometimes people don't quite believe it in some contexts. Maybe here it's more common in a conference like this that more people have done it.
It's a progressive audience.
Very progressive audience. But sometimes I go to programming forums on the internet where trunk-based development is still controversial, and so I try to write the book for a very broad audience.
Right, makes sense. And so, how many case studies do you have in the book then?
I don't know if I counted them.
It's like 10 or something? Like quite a few?
Seven, I think. Okay. But those are, by the way, only the ones that I could put in the book, because to get 7 case studies, I had to talk to maybe 15 companies. And not all of them could quite make it with the, the time frame of when the book was gonna come out, or perhaps they didn't want to disclose some things, or it just didn't work out. So in reality, I spoke to at least 15 companies to get 7 case studies. So you can imagine that, and those are only the ones that I know about or that my colleagues know about. So I think it's a pretty sizable portion of all companies out there that are actually using this practice.
Interesting, because I think when you define continuous deployment, some people are like, oh yeah, of course, we do that all the time. And there's other people like, whoa, it goes all the way to production without any checks? That's completely unprofessional. How could, they get quite defensive, don't they?
Yeah, but actually, I've done it, and a fun fact is that the first company where I practiced this, can we use the microphones now?
I think we have.
Hello?
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you, sound people, for doing that.
Okay, I can stop shouting. So a fun fact is that the first company where I was practicing this basically didn't even make a big deal out of it. It was just we do continuous delivery, and it just so happens that we don't really have any manual checks in staging. Our pipelines just go straight to production. And I didn't really think twice about the significance of it, and I don't think neither did they particularly, but only then, I started to realize how, kind of groundbreaking it was for them to be doing it, because their quality gains were just so good that they just didn't have to think about it.
Okay.
It's definitely a thing that happens. It's possible, and you just have to be, have a certain culture in your organization, and everybody kind of needs to be on board. But if those conditions are met, I think is very, very achievable.
So, you just defined it in about a sentence, right? Every commit goes to production without manual checks. Why did you have to write a whole book? What are all the chapters and stuff in there?
Right. So basically, there's a bit of theory about why it is a good idea in the first place. For those of you who like, history, there's, something like continuous deployment stands on the shoulders of continuous integration, continuous delivery, DevOps. So there's a bit of history as to how did we get here to this point. Then how it basically relates and in my opinion, improves things like, your data metrics that you're measuring, hopefully, on your project, how it kind of ties into other principles like lean manufacturing, reducing inventory in the path to production as compared to the software value stream. And then actually, the rest of it is mostly practice. So how do you, first of all, build a product backlog that is well suited to continuous deployments to production? So how can you slice things in a way that you have taken all of the safety measures into account even before you start coding? Then there's some very extensive coding examples. So how do you add new features under continuous deployment? How do you refactor things that are already live? Yeah. That could be quite complicated. Then there's a whole chapter only about databases because, of course, there's a chapter about those. Yeah. And then finally, the part about testing in production, which is also a very cool practice that goes amazingly well with continuous deployment, enabled by feature flags. And then there's a lot of content about releasing. So what are the different release strategies? So it's kind of a simple practice in theory, but everything that supports it and everything you do around it is not so straightforward. So that's why I thought there would be the need to write a whole book about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you say it's simple, because I guess it's simpler to not have manual checks than to have manual checks. So in a way, it's kind of like a more elegant setup. Yeah,
absolutely. Right? So this is just from my experience working with
You're now the published author of this book. You don't have to caveat. You're as the official author of the O'Reilly book on the subject, I think.
As the most authoritative source about continuous deployment, I declare that it is, I really found it much simpler because basically you don't really have to think about your path to production all that much. You have to think about your code and you have to think about your tests and your observability. But you don't have to put cognitive effort into what is in production at the moment. Is it the commit from 2 weeks ago, from 2 days ago? Oh, we have a live issue. We need to push an urgent bug fix. Do we need to put some changes away, revert some commits? Who needs to do a manual approval for this deployment? Do we need to do a demo first? What is even in this deployment, right? Is it the branch that we built yesterday? Did that other one get merged yet? All of those questions kind of go away. So the workflow is actually much simpler. You code something, you write good tests, you think about, obviously everything that could go wrong, but then your path to production is incredibly simple. You do a push and 20 minutes later, users are using your code. So that's kind of the ultimate proof that it works and it's incredibly straightforward.
Reality-driven development, kind of you can't hide from the reality. Yeah. So why do companies do it? Is it for that simplified release process? Is that the advantage, or are there other reasons why it's good to do continuous deployment?
Well, it's good. Well, first of all, it simplifies things a lot, and that also means reducing costs, but also it just allows the business to move much faster, right? So it becomes incredibly easy if you want to just try something out in production really quickly, to just be hey, developers, look, we just need to validate something. Can you please add these little 2 lines just to see how it would look? And it's happened to me before that I would be oh yeah, sure, here's a feature flag for it. I'll send it over. It's going to be live in 20 minutes. Just enable the flag and you can see it. Yeah. So you can experiment much quicker, and ultimately, continuous deployment is not about continuously releasing new stuff because, of course, we have feature flags that control that in production. But the more often you deploy, the more often you can release if you wish to, and the more releases are uncomplicated and well tested if you test in production, for example.
So does that kind of feel different? Because I think when people who haven't done it think of it, they think it's scary. But you're describing almost a more experimental, joyful, safe situation.
Yeah, I think it is. So unfortunately, it's one of those practices that if you've never done it before, you're very skeptical about it, and you have to kind of be in a team that has done it to quite believe how simple and just straightforward it is, because it seems much more complicated in reality. But so.
Yeah, it feels good, basically.
Yeah, it feels great. It's just very
but what
simple.
stops people from trying it then? Is it just that fear because they don't know that it's awesome, or is there other kind of real barriers that should hold people back?
Right. So this is where it gets a bit complicated. So I would say there's two types of companies that I've seen that maybe don't want to do continuous deployment. I'm gonna start with the ones who, like the more straightforward ones are the ones where the quality gates are just not ready. So maybe they don't have a very good testing culture yet, so their coverage is pretty low. In that case, I would still recommend manual checks before production because you simply don't know if there's going to be a bug hiding somewhere. You just don't have the coverage. Perhaps your observability is bad. Like if you're still building up to all of those safety net practices, then it's absolutely fair and legitimate that you would still want manual checks as a last safety measures. But obviously, once you have replaced those with their automated equivalent, then they become redundant. So there's a lot of companies that are building up to it, but are not quite there yet, and that's perfectly fine. I also see, though, a lot of other companies where they already have all these practices, but they're still kind of clinging on to the old processes. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It's just more of a human trait, right? We like the feeling of control over something that could hurt us, like a deployment to production. What's more painful than a deployment to production gone wrong? So having kind of the oversight over that, and when that happens, how it happens, it can feel like it's really empowering you to catch defects, even though you have perfectly good tests, good observability, like your automation can take care of it. I think sometimes it's just a cultural thing that we need to move on from it. So
But I think the scary thing about that is, I think all these companies, they do sometimes do continuous deployment, but they basically just do it every now and again and under great stress, because they're like, okay, we've got a bug, we have to act quickly, like you said before. So there will be times when basically they need to turn things around quickly, but if they're not doing continuous deployment the rest of the week, then they're using those muscles only when it's in a really bad time for them.
Yeah, like it becomes like I think you yourself called it a two-track process, right, where all of the changes that are routine, that are really well thought, not done in a hurry, they have 1,000 manual approvals, and then you find yourself in an urgent bug fix situation. Your company is losing money, and you need to exercise like a path to production that is almost immediate because it's urgent, and you've never tried that. So it's like the worst possible time to send things to production quickly is when you're not used to it, and you've never done it elsewhere, basically. Yeah,
if it's good enough to save the company on Black Friday when you need to fix something, it's probably a good enough process for the other things that you're doing incrementally other days of the week. Interesting. So can you do it safely with junior people, or is this kind of an elite practice that you hire veteran developers who know how to do T2D and they've read all of Martin Fowler's books and so on, and that's what you need, or can it be something that is accessible for new people?
I think it can absolutely be done with junior people. In fact, that's something I've done before. In ThoughtWorks, we don't go with only senior people. We have what I think is a healthy mix of junior roles and senior roles and lead roles. And the only thing that I think is required is buy-in to continuous deployment itself, but also the safety practices. So like putting tests, checking the coverage. You can, imagine you have a junior developer who doesn't quite know like how your product works, how your tech stack works. You can still, do pair programming to mitigate that. But ultimately, the thing about the safety net practices is that failure and problems and errors are expected. So not just from the junior developers, because we don't want to gang up on junior developers. The most senior dev can have a really horrible day and be inattentive and push something bad through the pipeline. But the thing that's important is that the practice is about testing how you recover from failures over and over and over again. Every time you commit, you're testing thoroughly the quality of your path to production and how easily it lets you detect bad changes and then recover from bad changes with observability, for example. So I would say it's kind of an engineering practice that it's not about preventing failures, it's about recovering from them easily.
Right, so instead of relying on experience and scars and whatever from senior developers that they shouldn't do something. You've actually got explicit processes that provide those safety nets. So maybe in that case it should be a better place if you're a junior developer to start your career in that kind of environment.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get to see, that for me would be my dream environment, right? If I had just started, I see all of the safety nets that allow a commit to go undisturbed all the way to prod. And then that's something that perhaps if I work next on a legacy project, then I can be like, okay, what's missing here to get to that level of maturity?
Yeah. So you mentioned legacy. So I think if there's people in this audience who are convinced that, oh yeah, well, I should try continuous deployment, like how would you recommend they get started if they're not doing it now?
So what I've seen is that in companies that aren't doing it, if you have a greenfield project to get started with, maybe that's the softest approach, you can set up everything from scratch, your continuous integration, deliver your tests, your observability, like do things properly. Mm-hmm. And usually because it's something that's not live yet, there's also less resistance from the culture around you to trying something new, because hopefully it's a shiny new product. Why not continuously deploy it until we launch it, and then maybe just continue doing that if nobody complains that it breaks when you deploy it.
Although I guess a legacy application, and if we say legacy, that could mean application that is making money for the company, it's the salary system. If that exists and has users, it also gives you the ability to try some of the more advanced practices in continuous deployment of testing and production, seeing users' behavior, getting validation. Whereas if you're doing a greenfield system that no one is using, the trouble is that in a way that deployment cycle hasn't fully completed.
Yeah, so that's like one way you could introduce it to a company. But if you want to really prove it and you have to go to something legacy, then of course you need to set up first some proper quality gates. If something is legacy and untested, maybe you can use characterization testing. So create, a test suite that kind of treats it like a black box. Before you try something like that, you should put observability in place, but then you can definitely rethink about your pipeline and see what changes you can make safely with continuous deployment. Another thing you mentioned is testing in production. So just finding an opportunity to introduce feature flags in a legacy system that work well. To me, that's incredibly valuable from continuous deployment and delivery, because usually systems like that are completely unreliable in test environments, and you only really know if your changes work when you deploy them to prod, because maybe you don't have dev prod parity, or the configuration is completely different. There's 1,000 edge cases that you only see with production traffic, production data. So even just adopting that practice from CD, just testing in prod, it can really increase your confidence in what you deploy on that system, but also your confidence later in doing continuous deployment on it if you want to as well.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I guess you should do is make sure that you buy a copy of Valentina's book for each of your team members, right? That would be another recommended strategy.
Of course.
Yeah, good. I wonder if you could expand, because you mentioned feature flags, and that hints at one of the most important conceptual distinctions in the book, which is between release and deployment, which I guess are different things in your world.
Yeah, that's something I was hinting at earlier. Basically, with continuous delivery, something that I found is that usually there tends to be very little distinction between releasing something and deploying something, because you just work on a feature. Let's say it makes it all the way to staging, the code for that feature. Somebody does a thorough manual check, and then how do you release it? By deploying the code to production. Very simple. But when you do continuous deployment, obviously every commit is going to production. So unless you want to make a huge commit or a huge feature branch, which is an anti-pattern in and of itself, you have to deploy incomplete code to prod all the time. You do this with feature flags. So basically you turn the feature off and then you turn it back on again when you're ready to release it. Yeah. So basically, because this becomes mandatory with continuous deployment, because you have to hide the work in progress, then it's only basically, according to me, that with this practice, really you have to distinguish a deployment and a release. And a deployment becomes at that point a very routine technical event that happens 10, 15, 20 times a day, as often as somebody commits something. And because it is a pure technical event, it doesn't affect or shouldn't affect the user's perception of that system, then it can be purely managed by the engineering team, which is a big step forward, according to me, in
well,
in the industry.
Giving you control over basically what you're responsible for, right? That
Exactly.
If the engineering team wants to change some bits on a server in production, they are able to do so because they've got responsible feature flags.
Exactly. And on the other hand, a release, that can become a purely product event. So you have feature flags, you can decide to release something completely independently of when the engineering team has decided to deploy it. Like the only requirement is that the code has been deployed some time ago in production, and you can test it before you release it, and you can decide, okay, this is a good release date, this is a good release plan, let's do an A/B test rather than a canary. And if both engineering and product are doing their job well, then they are completely independent on separate schedules. So you get out of that situation where maybe your engineering team has to tell the product owner, no, please, we cannot release because we didn't deploy the code yet, because that's a given. And your product owner shouldn't, for example, be telling you, hey, hold off on a deployment because we still have this other release in progress for last week that would affect it negatively. So you basically can finally distinguish the two calendars. And engineering concerns become engineering concerns, and product concerns remain product concerns. So I think that's an especially pleasant aspect.
Well, I guess especially you're talking about enabling features, but I guess this would be really useful if you need to disable features, right? So if the way that you change things is by basically changing the code on the servers, then if someone says, the way we're offering discount coupons, it's wrong, it's offering clients like credit instead of debit. Okay, we need to turn it off. You don't need to kind of engineer a new branch that has different behavior. Someone can flip that switch and turn it off without there being drama, and you can deal with it as you need to.
Even better, like you can check it in production before you release it, so you would notice it even before even one real user has a chance to see it. But let's say you don't test it in production, still, with feature flags as they are today, like with all the frameworks, so they're becoming really advanced. You can release things as granularly and progressively as you want. So you want only your mobile users to see a certain feature first, you can. But also you can just do an incremental rollout where randomized users, maybe 1% of them sees a certain feature. So if you've made a mistake, you can not only spot it only when 1% of users have seen it, but you can also just roll it back immediately, because everything is independent of a deployment. It is happening at runtime.
So that makes me think, because you're talking about the prerequisites or the parts of continuous deployment, they all seem like the kind of sensible things to tackle anyway. Like, do you think that it would make sense for a company to set continuous deployment as an aspiration, kind of to unify everyone around the goal of improving the safety nets?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say you are a company that's not quite there yet, but you would like ideally in a hypothetical future to work towards continuous deployment. You have to justify that investment. So maybe immediately stating, look, we're going to invest this massive amount of resources and time from all of our engineers just to get to continuous deployment. It can feel very daunting because it's an untested practice. You don't know what benefit it's going to bring. But ultimately, all of the stepping stones to get there are worthwhile pursuits of their own. So having a great test suite, even if you don't enable continuous deployment, at the end, you're still left with a great test suite. Observability, static code analysis, these are all things that on their own are incredibly valuable. So you could set it as a goal, but still, split it into smaller goals that are absolutely worthwhile on their own. So, yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of small goals worthwhile on their own, I have one final question, which is, so at one point you had not written a book. Now you have written a book. What happened in between? How did that come about?
Right. So it's all a bit blurry. Basically, I had started a blog. And I had never written anything for the public before, but I wrote this article about continuous deployment after, actually, an XConf talk I gave a few years ago.
This book was at some stage an XConf talk, so all the other talks you've seen today, maybe in 3 years' time or so, they might be books as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I wrote basically like a transcript article about the XConf talk I gave. And it was about how to survive, distributed systems, chaos, and continuous deployment, all of the integration issues that you need to take into account, and all of that. So this became an article. And then Twitter happened, and O'Reilly somehow found it, and they wanted me to write a report at first. Then they thought, oh, you know what, you're right, there's a kind of a literary vacuum around it. Why don't we go for a book? So then we started the process, and for anyone who's interested in this, basically they have you write the whole manuscript. I had never written a book before, obviously, so I just started from page 1, and I started typing, and then I finished when I was at page 340 something. Then it has to go through like an extensive review process, of which you were part of. Thank you very much. And then it gets published somehow, and you receive it in the mail, a big box with 10 copies.
Sounds very simple the way you put it. Well, thank you for writing that book, and thank you for talking to us about it today.